Such a pretty song. Hareini Mechavein, continuing the song we started playing yesterday, the first song from Zusha's new album, Open the Gates. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. There we go. Who is with us on a Monday evening? Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Hannah in New York, Pauline in Chicagoland, Nancy in North Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Debbie in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Belle in North Texas, John in Maine, Bill in Mid-Missouri, PK in Colorado, Tom in frozen PA, may warm up soon, Gwen in Kalamazoo, Sharon, can't believe it's a fireplace night tonight when it was over 70 degrees last week. If you don't like the weather, just wait a minute, right? Yosef in Lowell, Massachusetts, Paula in the Great Northwest, Guy in Ohio, James in Indianapolis, Paula in Chicago. What's news is Ruth in Kentucky, David in Indiana. Welcome everybody over there on the YouTube side. Yitzhak in Kansas City and Aoife in Florida. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by Florence Martino, all the way from Perugia in Italy. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, and forgive me. And she's dedicating our class tonight for all AT members. It's so wonderful that you're sponsoring. Florence, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Okay, I find today's daf to be enjoyable, very enjoyable. As I was preparing it, and I hope you'll agree with me, it's not that it's one of those dafs where we have wonderful incidents and colorful stories that give us an insight into the personalities and daily lives of the sages, or a morality tale, that's very narrative based and fun for that reason. It's really, more parsing the nuances of these laws of yibum and chalitzah like we've been doing, but it's not bogging down, sort of in one case after another that's so similar to the previous. Rather, I just find that today's daf has a really lovely flow, and it would have been tougher for us to follow this daf if it happened at the beginning, but because we went right into a deep dive on how the sages think and how they derive these laws and why they state these tough and liminal cases. And see if you agree with me. I just found the logic today to really flow nicely. All right, so we left off yesterday where we have this disagreement, right, with Rabbi Shimon and the other sages. In this case, where my messy chart that we were using yesterday. I'll just draw it one more time to be real clear, right? So Reuven, Shimon, and Binyamin, who's born late, are brothers, right? These are brothers. And then Dinah is Reuven's wife, and Miriam is Shimon's wife. And Binyamin's not born yet, right? And so then Reuven dies, and Dinah comes before Shimon for yibum. And then we looked at different cases where they actually perform yibum and she becomes his wife. Now she's Shimon's wife. Or where they didn't do anything yet, but they have a levirate bond because they have some obligation to do either yibum or chalitzah. or they perform this unusual thing of levirate betrothal, right, which is more than just having the obligation to do yibum, but less than performing yibum. And those were different cases. But even in the case where they actually perform yibum, and then Binyamin is born, the late brother, and then Shimon dies also. So now both of these women become Yevamas to their Yavam, which is Binyamin. Now, Binyamin never coexisted with Reuven. So according to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon, because Dinah was once Reuven's wife, and he is a brother with whom Binyamin never coexisted, so therefore she is prohibited to ever marry Binyamin. You can't be with your brother's wife, and there's not going to be a yibum exception to the prohibition that you can never marry a woman who was your brother's wife if you did not coexist with that brother. So Dinah prohibited to Binyamin, and because Dinah and Miriam were co-wives for a time with Shimon, so then she as a co-wife to Dinah is also exempt from Binyamin, and they just go out and marry other people, and there's no obligations with Binyamin. That's according to the rabbis. Rabbi Shimon said, wait a minute. When Binyamin was born, it was irrelevant that Dinah was once married to Reuven, because the fact is, when Binyamin was born, there were simply two wives of Shimon, his brother Shimon. These brothers did coexist, right? Shimon was alive in Binyamin's lifetime. And so, when Shimon dies, it's a simple case of he was a man with two wives. Now they both come before Binyamin for yibum, and he's going to perform either yibum or chalitzah with one of them, only one of them. And then the other one is simply free to go out and do whatever she wants. If they perform chalitzah with one of them, that one is also free to go out and do what she wants. Or if they decide to perform yibum, okay, so then one of these women ends up married to Binyamin, the other one is free. That's according to Rabbi Shimon. So Rav Menashe bar Zevid said before Rav Huna, he sat and said, what is the reason that Rabbi Shimon allows the third brother to marry the wife of his brother with whom he did not coexist? They're saying, why does Rabbi Shimon disagree with the rabbis? Why does he say that the fact that Dinah was once married to Reuven, with whom Binyamin never coexisted, how can we just ignore that? Okay, when he was born, now she's married to Shimon, but the fact is, at some point she was Reuven's wife. He never coexisted with Reuven. Therefore, she should be prohibited to him, and as a co-wife, Miriam should be prohibited also. In other words, why doesn't Rabbi Shimon accept this argument of the rabbis? What is the reason that Rabbi Shimon allows the third brother to marry the wife of his brother with whom he did not coexist, where she was taken in levirate marriage prior to his birth? The Gemara also wonders, what is Rabbi Shimon's reason? The reason is, as he stated in that same Baraisa, since the third brother came and found her in a permitted state, that she was already married to his second brother with whom he did coexist, and she was never for a moment prohibited to him, because, if it would have been different if they hadn't already married when Binyamin was born. Then maybe we could argue that she was, since they hadn't performed yibum yet, if when Binyamin was born, that bond hadn't been created yet, they were just, deciding whether or not to marry. Okay, well then when he was born, then she really is just the widow of Reuven, and in that situation, maybe Rabbi Shimon would agree that the result should be like the rabbis say. But since they were married when Binyamin was born, the Gemara also wonders, what is Rabbi Shimon's reason? The reason is, as he stated in the same Baraisa, since the third brother came and found her in a permitted state, and she was never for a moment prohibited to him, he may perform levirate marriage with her. Rather, the question was as follows. Rabbi Shimon gave such a persuasive explanation of his opinion that what we should be asking is, what is the reason for the rabbi's opinion? Why would the rabbis disagree with this excellent argument offered by Rabbi Shimon? And the Gemara answers that the verse states, Deuteronomy 25:5, her brother-in-law will take her to him to be his wife and consummate the levirate marriage. And this means that the first levirate bond is still upon her. right? The fact is, Reuven's house was never built up. The whole purpose of yibum is that because Reuven died without children, the next brother in line should marry her, produce a child that will become Reuven's heir. But Shimon died before creating an heir with Dinah. So the fact is, Reuven's house was never built up. I believe Sharon asked this question at the end of yesterday's class. So this means the levirate bond is still upon her. Her bond, the obligation to create in yibum is still upon her that was created when Reuven died. Even after she is taken as a wife by the second brother, her earlier status as a wife of her late first husband is still in effect. And so that's why the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Shimon. Now the Gemara challenges this. But what about that which we learn in a Mishnah on page 38 of this tractate? If he took his Yevama in marriage as his wife, then her legal status is that of his wife in every sense, right? So this is what Rabbi Shimon would say. Listen, once they did perform yibum and Dinah became Shimon's wife, it doesn't matter that she became his wife because she came before him for yibum after the death of Reuven. Now that they performed yibum, Dinah is no less Shimon's wife than Miriam. They are co-wives. She is his wife and he is her husband in every sense of the word. And her past is irrelevant. That's what Rabbi Shimon would say, and the Gemara is saying the same thing. Why wouldn't the rabbis accept that? Now the Gemara challenges this. But what about that which we learned in every sense? And this teaches the fact that she's his wife in every sense. This teaches, now we're at the top of 20a. Today our daf is page 20. That he must divorce his Yevama with a bill of divorce, and she does not also require chalitzah, that once they perform yibum. Now, what they might say is, we don't want to be married to each other forever. We want to perform yibum to produce a child in the name of Reuven, who tragically died. But as for my household, says Shimon, Miriam and I are happy. We don't really want a second wife in this situation. So Miriam agrees that you and I, Shimon and Dinah will sleep together once, or as many times as it takes to get her pregnant. She should have a child, with God's help, and then we'll divorce. Now, does she require a divorce? If the yibum, the intercourse, the marital relations that they're going to have is just to produce a child, to fulfill the mitzvah that Reuven should have an heir, then do they really need to give a bill of divorce? Does he need to give her a get, right, the Jewish instrument of divorce, since they didn't stand under a chuppah and have an engagement party and then a marriage and sheva brachas and, all the trappings of marriage? Do they really need the divorce? Yes, they need the divorce. Even if all they did was sleep together once for the purpose of building up Reuven's house, that act marries them. And if they're going to part company, which they're certainly allowed to do, they have to do that through a proper bill of divorce. And she does not also require chalitzah. Why would she require chalitzah? Chalitzah is the ceremony which is the alternative mitzvah to yibum. You perform yibum, you don't perform chalitzah. You want to part company, you do so with a get, with a proper divorce. And he may remarry her if he wishes after the divorce. Obviously, so long as she didn't go and marry some other guy in the meantime, then she's going to remain permitted to him. Even if they divorce, they can remarry. Now, as the law is not ruled in accordance with the opinion that after he performs the mitzvah, she is once more forbidden to him as his brother's wife. You might have thought that, a brother's wife is prohibited to you unless there's a yibum situation. If, for example, Reuven and Dinah had a child, then when he died, there is no yibum. Yibum is only when the man dies childless. If they had a child together, okay, then she's simply a widow, and she is forever prohibited not only to Benjamin, but also to Shimon, because you cannot marry or be with your brother's wife. The exception to that is yibum. Wait a minute. So why, right? And after he performed, so you might have thought that after they performed the mitzvah of yibum, just the marital relation aspect of it, the intercourse aspect of it, that then they would, that the prohibition would return, brother's wife, and they can't remain married. False. If they perform yibum, now they're married. Just through that act of intercourse, they are now married. If they don't want to stay together, needs a get. Why? Thereto, let the law say that the verse states, and consummate the levirate marriage, as explained above, meaning that the first levirate bond is still upon her, and she should also require chalitzah, I guess before coming before Binyamin. We'll just let that go. Now the Gemara answers, it is different there, as the verse states, and take her to him to be his wife, right? When they perform yibum, she becomes his wife. We learned that in Deuteronomy 25:5. To teach that once he has taken her, her legal status is that of his wife, in every sense. And the Gemara objects, well, if so, here too, in the case of a brother born after the yibum, vis-a-vis Binyamin, right? Now we're talking about Binyamin. So if so, in the case of the brother born after the yibum of Shimon and Dinah, according to the opinion of the rabbis, then maybe this same principle should apply. And the Gemara answers that the merciful one states, and consummate the levirate marriage, ve'yibema. That is, even after the marriage, she is still considered to be the wife of the deceased brother with respect to any brothers who are born later. And that does seem to be what the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon are saying. She's his wife in every sense. But somehow the fact that she was once married to Reuven and his house was never built up is still going to affect Binyamin, and that's why she's prohibited to Binyamin. That's the law according to the majority, right? They who rejected Rabbi Shimon's opinion. So the Gemara asks, what did you see to distinguish in this way and say that once she married, the levirate obligation is totally abrogated with regard to chalitzah, but that she remains prohibited as the wife of a brother with whom one did not coexist with respect to any brothers born in the future? The Gemara answers, it stands to reason to say, toss that which is permitted on that which is permitted, and toss that which is prohibited on that which is prohibited. In other words, in cases where the woman becomes permitted to her yavam through yibum, it stands to reason that this permitted state is absolute. That's why they end up married. But with regard to the prohibition against taking the wife of a brother with whom one did not coexist, it stands to reason that the verse comes to teach that she retains her prohibited status with respect to any brothers born in the future. That is the rabbi's reasoning. Right? She became permitted to Shimon because yibum applied and they performed yibum, and now she's his wife, and that's why she's permitted to him in every way. But vis-a-vis Binyamin, she never came before Binyamin for yibum. Therefore, her status as the widow of Reuven, the brother with whom Binyamin never coexisted, that status remains, and there's no reason to throw it out with respect to Binyamin. So the Gemara suggests, but according to Rabbi Shimon, who said that since he came and found her in a permitted state, meaning that when Binyamin was born, she was already married to Shimon, a brother born subsequently may perform yibum, since she was never for a single moment prohibited to him as the widow of a brother with whom he did not coexist. She was never prohibited to him. However, if that is so, consider the case of one's maternal half-sister, right? So somebody that you and she have the same mother, but not the same father, who married his paternal half-brother. Now, their marriage was fully permissible since the husband and wife were in no way related to each other, right? So what happened there? So there was a man and a woman who got married, and they each brought a child to the marriage. Like, it's like the Brady Bunch. Like, it's gross to us to think that Greg and Marcia Brady could get married, right? Because they were living under the same house. But let's say that, what was Mr. Brady's name? And the parents, I can't even remember. Okay, but let's say that the parents only got married after the kids were grown up and out of the house. right? So if they got married, then what would be so bad if, Greg Brady, as an adult, who was already an adult when his father married this other woman, his second wife, and what would be so bad if Marcia Brady was already an adult when her mom married this man, Mr. Brady, who was, her second husband, that Greg and Marcia could marry each other. They're not brother and sister, right? They're not brother and sister. So they could get married. Now, what problems would this end up creating? Who married his paternal half-brother, their marriage was fully permissible since the husband and wife were in no way related to each other. But then his brother was born, right? So then, like Mr. and Mrs. Brady then had a child together, okay? And then his brother was born and the married brother died. In that case, am I even making that up? They each brought kids to the marriage, right? Or did they all have all those kids together? If so, then forget that I'm talking about the Brady Bunch. But I'm talking about a case where parents who had children from previous marriages then married, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. And then his brother was born, and the married brother died. So in that case, let the sister enter into yibum with her newly born half-brother for the same reason, since he came and found her in a permitted state, as when he was born, she was already his brother's wife. Now the Gemara challenges this suggestion. How can you say that? What happened to the prohibition against marrying his sister? To where did it go? The widow is the maternal sister of the newly born brother. Half-sister, okay, but definitely a sister. As opposed to the ones who came from separate marriages, went after those parents married, and then they had a new brother, so he's a half-brother to both, the brother from a previous marriage of the father, and the sister from a previous marriage, the daughter of the mother, and then that older brother died, so now this brother, this younger brother, right, he comes up, this widow comes before him for yibum. She was able to marry his half-brother because she was not related to him, but she can't marry him, right, the new brother, because she is his half-sister. So what happened in the prohibition against marrying the wife of a brother with whom one did not coexist? To where did it go? In this case as well, the prohibition against marrying the wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist already applied from the first brother. So why does Rabbi Shimon see this as abrogated by marriage? And the Gemara answers that the comparison is unsound. This prohibition against marrying one's sister has no case where it is permitted. And so in this case, also it is not canceled. Whereas that prohibition against marrying a brother's wife has a case where it is permitted, which is when that brother dies childless, and that widow, who's not otherwise related to you, is not your half-sister, has no other relationship to you, then you are permitted to marry her, and that's called yibum. There is no analogous exception to the prohibition on marrying your own sister. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. Now we go to Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 2. The sages stated a principle about a Yevama, the widow. Whoever is forbidden by a prohibition of forbidden relations to her Yavam, the surviving brother, neither performs chalitzah nor enters into yibum, and rather is completely exempt. If she is forbidden by a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah or a prohibition stemming from sanctity, as will be explained, then, since in these cases the obligation of yibum is not fundamentally nullified, she performs chalitzah in order to become free of the levirate bond, and due to her prohibition, she may not enter into yibum. Right? So if the widow has some kind of familial relation to the brother-in-law, other than the fact that she was the wife of his brother, then that's all those cases that we learned in chapter 1. And therefore, she cannot enter into yibum with him. Yibum is absolutely nullified. And because yibum is nullified, chalitzah is nullified as well. But if the reason that she is prohibited to the brother-in-law is not some kind of familial relationship, but rather some other Torah or rabbinic-based law, like a high priest, right? A high priest is not permitted to marry a widow. So if yibum occurs in a situation where a high priest has a brother who would also be a Cohen, and this Cohen's, so his younger brother, who's just a Cohen, not a high priest like him, that guy dies. So now this woman comes before the high priest for yibum. But a high priest is not permitted to marry a widow. So they're not going to permit this marriage. Is she disqualified from yibum altogether so that the high priest and the Yevama need not perform chalitzah? No. They are obligated in yibum. It's just that they cannot perform yibum because he's the high priest and he can't marry a widow, and therefore they must perform chalitzah. That's what we just learned here. And the sages stated another principle. If two sisters who had been married to two brothers who subsequently died happened before the third brother for yibum, and one of those sisters is a close relation to this third brother and is therefore forbidden to him, she is exempt from yibum. But the other, her sister, her sister, who is her Yevama, I guess a sister who is also her sister-in-law, performs chalitzah or enters into yibum. In this case, they are not ruled to be two sisters who happen before him simultaneously for levirate marriage, since one of them is prohibited to him as a forbidden relation, and therefore she never actually happened before him at all. Now, how could two sisters come before a man and one of them is related to him through some kind of familial relationship and the other one isn't? Must be that they were half sisters, right? So one of them could be related to the brother, the surviving brother-in-law, and the other one not, right? By some other relationship than that they were the wife of the brother who died. And so in that case, the one who is prohibited through that familial relationship, she's exempt. But the other sister can perform chalitzah or yibum, and we'll see how that happens. And the Mishnah explains, a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah is referring to secondary forbidden relationships, which are prohibited not by Torah law but by rabbinic law. And the sages prohibited marriage to certain women who were not forbidden by the Torah but were nevertheless deemed forbidden incestuous relations, as we will discuss. And a prohibition stemming from sanctity, this is referring to marriage of a widow to a high priest, to a Kohen Gadol, or a divorcee, or a woman who has performed chalitzah already to any priest, or a daughter born from an incestuous or adulterous relationship, a mamzeret, or a Gibeonite woman to an Israelite, and also an Israelite woman to a Gibeonite, or a son born from an incestuous or adulterous relationship, which is a mamzer. That is Mishnah number 3. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, the principle stated in the Mishnah, at the beginning of our Mishnah, about Yevamos, right? About Yevamos, the women who are the widows of this man who didn't have a child. And now the sages gave this principle, right? The principle is that whoever is forbidden by a prohibition or forbidden relations to her Yavam, neither chalitzah nor yibum, because she's just exempt, since she cannot end up married to this man because it would create an incestuous relationship. So now the Gemara asks, well, this principle stated in our Mishnah about the Yevamos, what other case does it add? Since the entire list of cases involving forbidden relations was already detailed in chapter 1, what is this Mishnah coming to add? And Rav from Bar Papa said, it comes to include the case of a co-wife of a sexually underdeveloped woman, an Elonis, who is sterile and incapable of having children. Not only does an Elonis herself not enter into yibum, since she is unable to give birth, and the purpose of yibum is to build up the brother's house, the one who died without an heir. So, and since she cannot do that, so she's exempt from yibum, and so is her co-wife. Since she is unable to give birth. But her rival wife, her co-wife, is exempt as well. That's what this principle adds. And this is like the principle of Rav Asi, who said that the co-wife of an Elonis is forbidden because the Elonis herself remains prohibited to the Yavam as the wife of his brother, as she was never rendered permitted by the obligation of yibum, since yibum doesn't apply to her. Therefore, her co-wife is the co-wife of someone prohibited as a forbidden relation. And there are those who say that Rav from Bar Papa's statement was made in a different context. It was taught in the Mishnah, whoever is forbidden to her Yavam by a prohibition of forbidden relations is completely exempt, which implies that it is specifically in such a case that her co-wife is forbidden. But any case when one wife is not forbidden by a prohibition of forbidden relations, but is instead forbidden for some other reason, then her co-wife is not forbidden. And this case comes to exclude what? Rafram said it excludes the co-wife of an Elonis, who requires levirate marriage or chalitzah. Because the Elonis is not prohibited as a foreign relation, she's prohibited as one who is incapable of performing yibum for its purpose. And this statement is not in accordance with the opinion of Rav Asi. What is the law on the co-wife of an Elonis? If the two wives of one man fall before his brother for yibum, and one of them is an Elonis, then her co-wife may either perform chalitzah or enter into yibum. And this is in accordance with the opinion cited in the Gemara as, and there are those who say contrary to the opinion of Rav Asi, meaning the co-wife of an Elonis is not like the co-wife of a woman who has a prohibited familial relationship with the Yavam. Right? In that case, if they were to perform yibum, there would end up an incestuous marriage, and that's why we don't allow it to happen. The Elonis just can't perform yibum for the purpose of yibum to build up the house of the dead brother. Therefore, she's exempt, but the co-wife is not, and she does come before the Yavam for either yibum or chalitzah, and that makes sense because we want to at least give the chance to perform the mitzvah, either to build up the brother's house or to perform chalitzah. Now the Mishnah states, her sister, who is her Yavama, performs chalitzah or enters into yibum. Now the Gemara clarifies, whose sister? If we say it is the sister of one who is forbidden due to a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah, since by Torah law she is cast before him for yibum, then this would in fact simply be a case of two sisters who fell simultaneously before the Yavam, both for yibum, since according to Torah law there is no prohibition against entering into yibum with such a woman. If so, it turns out that he encounters the sister of the woman with whom he has a levirate bond. But that case has already been taught. Rather, it must refer to the sister of a woman who is forbidden to him by a prohibition of forbidden relations. And since he may not enter into yibum with a forbidden relation, her sister is not considered to be the sister of a woman with whom he has a levirate bond. Therefore, the sister may be taken in yibum. And the Mishnah states that a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah is referring to secondary forbidden relationships, which are prohibited by rabbinic law. And the Gemara asks, why is this called a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah? And Abaye said this is because it is a mitzvah to listen to and obey the words of the sages, right? So the Torah spells out the prohibited incestuous relationships, and then the rabbis will add certain relationships to that list as a fence around the Torah, because we could slip into one of the prohibited relationships, and this protects us from that happening. Now, the Mishnah states, a prohibition stemming from sanctity, right? So there's there's the prohibition of a prohibited relationship, then there's the prohibition of a mitzvah that applies, and they're calling that, well, listen to the sages, because it defined a certain relationship that wasn't prohibited as incestuous in the Torah, but they said it is a prohibited relationship because it's too similar to one of the prohibited incestuous relationships. That's called prohibition resulting from a mitzvah. And then there's the other kind of prohibition called prohibition resulting from sanctity. And that's, that the high priest can't marry a widow. That's a prohibition resulting from sanctity. It's not that there's an incestuous relationship involved, but the Torah has said that the high priest can't marry a widow. A prohibition stemming from sanctity is referring to a marriage of a widow to a high priest, or a divorcee to a common priest, or a chalitzah to a common priest. A woman who had already come up for yibum and she and her Yevamos performed chalitzah. Okay, she became free. She can go marry almost any other Jew, but she can't marry a priest because the fact that she once performed chalitzah, it's like she had a bond that was severed, and that's considered to be like a divorcee. She's permitted to all other Jews, but she can't marry a Cohen. And if he does marry her, it's a valid marriage, but he can no longer serve in the temple or bless the congregation as a priest. Now, why are these called a prohibition stemming from sanctity? As it is written with regard to the priests, they shall be sacred to their God. They shall not take a woman that is a harlot or profaned, neither shall they take a woman divorced by her husband. Leviticus 21, 6 and 7. And it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda switches the terms. A prohibition resulting from a mitzvah, this refers to a widow and the high priest, or a divorcee or a chalitzah and a common priest. And why is this called a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah? As it is written in summarization at the end of Leviticus 27:34, these are the mitzvahs, these are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. A prohibition stemming from sanctity, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is referring to these secondary relationships that are forbidden by rabbinic law. And why is this called a prohibition stemming from sanctity? Abaye said, whoever fulfills the words of the sages is called sacred. So it's called a prohibition stemming from sanctity because the rabbis issued a decree, and if you follow their decree, then you are a holy person. Rava objects. Rava said to him, the language you use is not precise, since if so, that if it's true that anyone who follows the decrees of the sages is sacred, well then whoever does not fulfill the words of the sages is not called sacred, which implies that he is also not called wicked. However, anyone who transgresses the words of the sages is in fact referred to as wicked. Rather, Rava said that the reason why this is called a prohibition stemming from sanctity is that the term sanctity, holy, indicates a differentiation or separation. Kodesh, right? Kedusha, the Hebrew word for holiness, means separate from, right? What does it mean that something is holy? Basically, something is holy because God said so, right? Because God is holy, God is set apart, and anything that God tells us is holy, okay, that is holy. But what does it really mean? It means that it is set apart from that which is mundane. Rather, Rava said the reason why this is called a prohibition stemming from sanctity is that the term sanctity indicates differentiation or separation, and there is a principle that you must sanctify yourself by refraining from that which is permitted to you by Torah law. The sages decreed against secondary forbidden relations so that one would not eventually come to transgress Torah law. The fence around the Torah, right? Most rabbinic decrees they say that there's certain things you cannot do lest you engage in them and predictably end up violating Torah laws. So in order to sanctify yourself by following the decrees of the sages, you end up refraining from doing something that would have otherwise been permitted by Torah law. Now, we've also seen the teaching that you should not take vows upon yourself to prohibit to yourself things that are otherwise permitted to you in the Torah and by rabbinic decree. You shouldn't go around saying, well, I want to be holier, so I'm just going to, not touch something that would have been permitted to me because this will make me holy. You don't do that. But if the sages say this is something you shall not do, then you listen to the sages, right? And here's a note from Rav Steinsaltz saying that the Ramban, Nachmanides, explains that this is the true meaning of the mitzvah, you shall be sacred. Leviticus 19:2, right? You shall be holy for I am holy. Sanctity requires one to refrain from even that which the Torah permitted. And the Ramban explains that it is possible for one to be vile, to become a vile person, without violating any other explicit Torah prohibitions. For example, the Torah does not limit how much one may eat or how frequently one may engage in sexual intercourse. A hedonist could therefore spend all his time indulging in sensual pleasures and not technically violate the Torah. Therefore, the Torah stressed, you shall be holy, right? So you have to think about sanctifying yourself and living your life in a way that you don't overindulge in that which the Torah permits. Now, the Mishna states that the levirate bond of a widow to a high priest requires her to perform chalitzah, and she may not enter into yibum. Right? The reason they can't do yibum is because then she would become the wife of a high priest, and a high priest can't marry a widow. But that's not like she can't marry that man because she happens to be his daughter. Right? That's a prohibited relationship that would lead to an incestuous union if they married. Rather, because he happens to be the high priest, and he wasn't always the high priest, so, if this had happened when he was just a priest and not a high priest, they would have been permitted to each other and they would have performed yibum or chalitzah. But now that he's the high priest, they cannot marry, so they can't perform yibum, but she's not exempt from chalitzah. They must perform chalitzah. And the Gemara comments, the law that a widow does not enter into yibum with a high priest is taught categorically, merely in a general manner. It is no different whether she is a widow from marriage or whether she is a widow from betrothal alone. Now, granted, she certainly may not enter into yibum if she is a widow from marriage, since she is forbidden to the high priest by the positive mitzvah stated in the verse, and he shall take a wife in her virginity. And by the prohibition stated in the verse, a widow or once divorced, these shall he not take. And the positive mitzvah, yibum, does not override both the prohibition, he may not marry a widow, and the positive mitzvah, he must marry a virgin, together. However, if she is a widow from betrothal, right? Imagine that the brother who died before having children, he never married her, but they were betrothed. They were promised to each other. So now it's a little different because the brother who was betrothed to her and then died before having children, they never consummated that union. So yes, she's considered a widow because she was promised to him, and after that betrothal, she became prohibited to any other man. But she is a virgin. They never consummated that union. So now you have the positive mitzvah of yibum. Shouldn't it override the one negative mitzvah that she was betrothed to this man? Even for a high priest, wouldn't you think that maybe he could, even for a regular priest, wouldn't you think, for the high priest, even for the high priest, wouldn't you think that since they never consummated that union, that now she would be permitted? And the answer is no, because that betrothal was a betrothal, and she therefore is a widow, even though she's a virgin. Where am I? And so it is no different whether she is a widow from marriage or she is a widow from betrothal alone. Granted, she certainly may not enter levirate marriage if she is a widow from marriage, because of what we just said. However, if she is a widow from betrothal alone, then there is only a prohibition, as she is still a virgin. In that case, why not say that the positive mitzvah of yibum should come and override the prohibition against marrying a widow from betrothal? And Rav Giddel said that Rav said in answer to this question, the verse states, his Yevamos shall ascend to the gate to the elders and say, my brother-in-law refused to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He did not wish to consummate the yibum. That's the chalitzah formula. That's what they say when they perform chalitzah. Now, as there is no need for that verse to state his Yevamos, since it is clear to whom the verse is referring, and no new information is added by this word. So what is the meaning when the verse states, by the time you get to the recital of what is the language of chalitzah, we know we're talking about his Yevamos. So why was the term his Yevama included in the verse that teaches what they say in the chalitzah ceremony? It comes to teach that there is one Yevama who ascends for chalitzah but may not ascend for yibum. And her brother-in-law is not given a choice. And who is this? This is a woman with whom it is prohibited for her Yavam to enter into yibum, as he would be liable for the violation of a prohibition, and the positive mitzvah of yibum does not override the prohibition. The Gemara asks, say that this is referring to those women who are forbidden and would be liable to receive the penalty of kares as well, i.e., these too may not enter into yibum, but nevertheless require chalitzah. And the Gemara answers, the verse states, and if the man does not wish to take his Yevama. And this implies that if he wishes, he takes her in yibum. It depends upon his wishes. However, one who is eligible for yibum is eligible for chalitzah. And conversely, one who is ineligible for yibum is ineligible for chalitzah and therefore does not require chalitzah at all. Since those relations that carry a penalty of kares, the prohibited familial relationships, they have no possibility of entering into yibum, they do not require chalitzah either, as we learned in chapter 1 and in the general principles stated here in Mishnah number 3 of chapter 2. And the Gemara asks, if so, those relations who are forbidden, as he would be liable for the violation of a standard prohibition, also should not require chalitzah, as they may not enter into yibum. And the Gemara answers, but the merciful one included one category of Yevama, who is eligible for chalitzah alone and not yibum. Usually yibum or chalitzah, either one is a choice for both the Yavam and the Yevama, and they decide, are we going to do yibum or are we going to do chalitzah? But there's this case where they must do chalitzah and yibum is not on the table. And who is eligible for chalitzah alone and not yibum. And how is this specified in the Torah by the Holy One? When this phrase, his Yevama, was added into the chalitzah language. And the Gemara asks, and what did you see to conclude that the additional term is referring to relations who are forbidden and with whom he should be liable for the violation of prohibition, and not to those who are liable to receive kares? Now we're on 20b. The Gemara answers, that stands to reason, since betrothal takes effect with those women who are forbidden and with whom he would be liable for the violation of a prohibition. That is, if a man betroths a woman who is forbidden to him and with whom he would be liable for the violation of a prohibition if they married, then although he violates a prohibition when he betroths her, nonetheless the betrothal is valid. And it cannot be ended without a bill of divorce. They shouldn't have betrothed. They did betroth. Now they have to write out a get. In contrast, betrothal does not take effect at all with those who are forbidden and would be liable to receive the punishment of kares. If you tried to betroth your sister, with whom if you married her it would be incest, then that betrothal has no meaning, and if you did it, you wouldn't need a get afterward. But if you tried to betroth somebody that was a rabbinic prohibition that says the two of you can't get married, then you can't get married, but you'd need a get to undo the betrothal. Now, Rava raised an objection to the explanation of Rav. It is taught in a baraisa with regard to a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah and a prohibition together. With regard to a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah and a prohibition stemming from sanctity, these are the two categories where if that comes up, they are not allowed to perform yibum, but they must perform chalitzah. That if he engages in intercourse with such a woman, right, he shouldn't have done it, but he did it, right? If this high priest had intercourse with his Yevama, who is a widow, he can't do that, but he did it. Or he performs chalitzah with her. Shouldn't have done it, but he did it. Then her rival wife, her co-wife, is exempt, even though it was prohibited for him to have engaged in intercourse with this woman who is prohibited to him through a mitzvah or prohibited through sanctity. If he did it, then that is going to exempt the co-wife. If it enters your mind that women who are forbidden, as he would be liable for the violation of a prohibition, require chalitzah by Torah law, but do not require yibum, then when he engages in intercourse with his Yevama, why is the rival wife exempt? If there's no biblical mitzvah to engage in intercourse with her, his action would carry no halachic validity, and the co-wife should not become exempt. Now, Rabbah raised the objection, and then he resolved it. The Brisa teaches it disjunctively, meaning it did not at all deal with the same case. When the Brisa says engages in intercourse with her, it is referring to a prohibition resulting from a mitzvah. If one engages in intercourse with a Yevama who is prohibited to him by rabbinic law, since by Torah law yibum with her is valid, then although his act involved the transgression of a rabbinic decree, he nevertheless fulfilled the Torah obligation, and the co-wife is thereby exempt. When the Brisa says perform chalitzah with her, it is referring to a prohibition stemming from sanctity. And by Torah law, there is no option of yibum because of the prohibited relation, and therefore only chalitzah will exempt the rival wife, not yibum. Rabbah raised an objection from that which was taught in the Tosefta. A man with crushed testicles, or with other wounds to his genitals, or one whose penis has been severed, one who is a eunuch caused by man and not from birth or by disease, or an elderly man, all of whom are incapable of fathering children, one either performs chalitzah or yibum. How so? If any of these infertile men died, and they had brothers, and they also had wives, and they then died childless, and the brothers proceeded to perform levirate betrothal with their wives, or gave them a bill of divorce, or perform chalitzah, whatever they did is done, i.e. their act was effective. And if any one of the brothers engaged in intercourse with the widow of one of those infertile men, he thereby acquired the woman as a wife according to the laws of levirate marriage. Now, basically, the principle that's operating here is that if a man was castrated on purpose, right, then he is not permitted to marry a Jewish woman according to Jewish law, right? And the inverse is also true. If the brothers died childless and the infertile men proceeded to perform levirate betrothal with their wives, or gave a bill of divorce, or performed chalitzah, whatever they did is done and took effect. And if they engaged in intercourse with their Yevama, they thereby acquired the Yevama as their wife. However, it is forbidden to maintain them, i.e. allow them to continue to live as husband and wife, because it is stated, Deuteronomy 23:2, one with crushed testicles or whose penis has been severed shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord. They are prohibited from entering the congregation, meaning they are prohibited to marry a Jewish woman. And if it enters your mind that women who are forbidden, as he would be liable for the violation, a prohibition, require chalitzah by Torah law, but do not require yibum, then one could ask, if they engaged in intercourse, why are they acquired as wives, even though there would be no mitzvah of yibum, because the men are prohibited from marrying them? Rather, Rav's opinion is rejected, and Rav has said there's an alternative explanation. The reason why a high priest does not take a widow from betrothal in levirate marriage is because that relationship is also a violation of both a positive mitzvah and a prohibition, and therefore a different positive mitzvah does not override it, because we have this principle that while a positive mitzvah might override a negative prohibition as long as that negative prohibition doesn't bear a charis penalty, a positive mitzvah will not override in a situation where there is both a negative prohibition and a positive mitzvah that conflicts with the first positive mitzvah. And here, in this case, as it is written, they shall be sacred to their God, Leviticus 21:6, which teaches that there is a positive mitzvah of sanctity associated with all prohibitions applying to priests. Therefore, any such prohibition contains both a positive and a negative mitzvah. You might think the positive mitzvah, perform yibum with the widow of your brother. That's the positive mitzvah, and it's going to override the negative mitzvah. He shall not marry a widow. What is the other positive mitzvah? He shall marry a virgin in the case of the high priest. But if she was only a widow of betrothal, right? If it was a widow of betrothal, then she was a virgin, right? So that is not, he's not violating that anymore. But they're saying, but the other positive mitzvah is they shall be sacred to their God. Now the Gemara asks, this resolves the issue of priestly prohibitions. But what is there to say about a daughter born from an incestuous or adulterous relationship, or a Gibeonite woman who are prohibited from entering the congregation due to considerations of sanctity? They too may not enter into yibum, despite the positive mitzvah, which would ordinarily override a prohibition. The Gemara answers, it is written with regard to all of the mitzvahs, sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be sacred. Leviticus 11:44. And this teaches that in addition to the prohibition, there is the positive mitzvah of sanctity. Now the Gemara raises an objection. If so, that there is this general mitzvah, commandment of sanctity, then every single prohibition in the entire Torah contains both a positive mitzvah and a prohibition. As it is written, sanctify yourselves. Rather, this reasoning must be rejected. You can't say that we're therefore going to, if we're saying there's a principle that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a negative mitzvah, like you will perform a bris, circumcision, on the 8th day, and that overrides, you shall do no work on Shabbos, because if the 8th day falls on Shabbos, the positive mitzvah overrides the negative mitzvah in that case, the negative commandment. But if we're also saying that a positive mitzvah does not override a situation where there is a negative mitzvah and a conflicting positive mitzvah, conflicting with the first positive mitzvah, then you will never find a situation where there isn't both a negative prohibition and a positive prohibition, positive commandment in place, because of this general commandment, sanctify yourselves, that applies to all the Jewish people. So you could never apply the principle positive commandment overrides negative commandment. Rather, this reasoning must be rejected. And Rav has stated a different reason. While in essence, the mitzvah of yibum does apply here, nevertheless, a widow from betrothal is prohibited from entering into yibum with the high priest by rabbinic decree, due to the case of a widow from marriage. Right? So they're going to say, well, he can't marry a regular widow, and therefore we're going to say he also can't marry a widow through betrothal, but who never consummated that marriage, because they might make a mistake. And if we allow them to marry a Yevama who was only a widow via betrothal, eventually they might make a mistake and marry a woman who was a full case widow. And the Gemara asks, well, then what is there to say about the case of the mamzeret or the Gibeonite women? There appears to be no reason for a rabbinic decree in these cases. And the Gemara answers, well, there one must say that intercourse with a female mamzer, even when the mitzvah of levirate marriage applies, was prohibited by rabbinic decree due to cases when the mitzvah of yibum does not apply. Right? Because you might be allowed to sleep with a woman who is a mamzer, a female mamzer, in a situation where there's yibum. If we allowed that, then people might think, oh, actually, you can marry a woman who is a mamzer. And we see that in the case of this yibum situation. So maybe we're generally allowed to marry a woman who's a mamzer. Unless people make that mistake, they prohibited them to perform yibum with a woman who happens to be a mamzer. And the Gemara asks, however, if that is so, and the yibum is prohibited lest it become confused with another case, then the wife of a paternal brother should not enter into yibum, by the same logic. Although the Torah allowed it, the sages should have established a rabbinic decree requiring that she perform chalitzah and not yibum, due to the case of the wife of a maternal brother. Right? A brother only steps in and performs yibum for his brother who died before having a child if they share the same father. We learned that a few days ago. If they're half-brothers who only share the same mother, yibum does not apply. He is his brother, and you can never marry his widow because she was the wife of your brother. Yibum does not come and override that situation in the case where he's only your maternal half-brother, only in the case of a paternal half-brother. Here they're saying, well, then maybe we should pass a rabbinic decree to prevent yibum with a paternal half-brother, just in case you would confuse and eventually come to perform yibum in the case of a maternal half-brother. And the Gemara answers, The merciful one made yibum dependent upon inheritance, and it is well known by everyone that only patrilineal relatives inherit, so there is no likelihood of this confusion coming to occur. And now we're going to see just a few cases quickly where basically they're saying, well, how can you permit that if you said that the reason we prohibit in certain cases and issue rabbinic decrees is because of that slippery slope where people will come to be confused and fall down this slope and commit these errors? Where whenever there's a chance to commit such an error, we should also have the rabbinic decree. And the Torah is saying, or the sages are saying, hey, not so fast. We're not going to apply that slippery slope argument anywhere where it might come to cause a confusion, only where it is likely to cause a confusion. So the Gemara objects further, a childless woman should not go into yibum, even though the mitzvah applies to her. There should be a rabbinic decree due to the case of a woman who has children, just in case they confuse it. And the Gemara answers, the merciful one made yibum dependent upon children. It is well known by everyone that the entire purpose of yibum is to establish one's brother's name, and that yibum applies only when there are no children. Here too, there's no likelihood of a mistake. And the Gemara issues another case. The wife of a brother with whom one did coexist should not enter into yibum. Then there should be a rabbinic decree against it because of the situation of a brother who did not coexist with his brother and where yibum does not apply. Unless people make that mistake, you shouldn't allow yibum where they did coexist, which would, negate yibum entirely. And the Gemara responds, the merciful one made yibum dependent upon a common dwelling together and coexistence of brothers, and this is well known by everyone, since the matter is explicit in the Torah. So the Gemara tries again. No woman should enter into yibum. There should be a rabbinic decree due to the case of the Elonis. If a woman is not permitted, who is an Elonis, sterile, we shouldn't allow regular women who are fertile to enter into yibum because people might end up getting confused and allow the Elonis to enter into yibum. And the Gemara answers, the merciful one made it clear. The Gemara answers, the case of an Elonis is not commonplace, and the sages did not institute rabbinic decrees on matters that are not common. And the Gemara says, well, if so, neither a female mamzer nor a Gibeonite woman is commonplace either. Therefore, since the likelihood of taking a mamzeret, a female mamzer, in yibum is so small, there is no danger that one might think it is permitted to marry a mamzeret, even where the mitzvah does not apply. So rather, Rava said it is necessary to reject these previous suggestions, and he offers a different reason. The first act of intercourse is prohibited by rabbinic decree due to the likelihood of a second act of intercourse. Although intercourse the first time with the Yevamos is the fulfillment of a positive mitzvah, which does override the prohibition, once the mitzvah is fulfilled with that act, now there's no longer any positive mitzvah involved. So afterward, this Yevamos becomes prohibited because there's no longer a positive mitzvah to override the prohibition on sleeping with your brother's wife. Therefore, due to the possibility that one might engage in intercourse a second time with this woman, the sages decreed that even the first act is prohibited. And the Gemara comments, this is also taught in a Baraisa. If one of those Yevamim who may not marry their Yevama due to a prohibition engaged in intercourse with her, he acquired her with the first act of intercourse. However, it is prohibited to retain her for a second act of intercourse. Okay, you did it, you weren't supposed to, and you did it anyway, but now you must divorce her and you may not sleep with her again. And the Gemara continues with a retraction from Rava. So Rava then said, and some say it was actually Rav Ashi who said, that which I said, that the reason for the rabbinic decree was to prevent a second act of intercourse, is not correct, as there is a simpler explanation. As Reish Lakish said about the same matter, in every place that you find a positive mitzvah and a prohibition applying to the same matter, if you can fulfill both of them together, this is best, and the positive mitzvah does not override the prohibition. And if there is not any possibility of fulfilling both the positive and the negative mitzvahs that apply, then let the positive mitzvah come and override the prohibition. Here too, in the case of yibum, it is possible by way of chalitzah to fulfill the positive mitzvah and not transgress the prohibition prohibiting marriage to these women. We're going to cut it off there. Bang, because it's late. All right, let me see if I have just quickly time for one or two questions. Okay. Yevamos 20. Sharon, my mind keeps going back to the children of King David. Wasn't the siblings' prohibition violated with them? One of his sons was enamored with a half-sister and tricked her into a close physical proximity situation and then raped her. What am I going to say? I'm not going to defend David's sons. There was a lot of trouble there. Solomon managed to emerge from that morass as a good and moral and qualified king. But those other brothers, I mean, there's a lot of trouble there. Sharon, how is the status of the aloneness determined? We started to get into that a little bit when the subject first came up, but we didn't go into it in any depth, and I don't have, those rules, right? But, it seems like it's not just, like the matriarchs who were unable to have children for a long time. It wasn't just the fact that they never had children that would have made them an aloneness. They were just barren for a long time. Aloneness doesn't mean barren. Aloneness means will never be capable of having a child. And how you make that determination, I don't know. Tom, I don't get the idea that if you're not called sacred, this implies you're also not called wicked. I think what they were saying there is generally when they're making a definition of something, it's interesting because we sometimes think that, well, if two things are opposite, if it's not a yes, it must be a no. But for the sages, if something is not a yes, well, then it might be a no, it might be a maybe, it might be something confusing or a doubt exists. And they wanted to get to where it's not like a realm of a range of possibilities, but they wanted to define somebody who doesn't listen to the words of the sages as not merely not sacred, but rather fully wicked. And that's really something they were referring to in passing, but I think that would be the logic. And finally, Sharon, if a Cohen marries a widow, can he subsequently become a Cohen Gadol? Can this marriage prevent his elevation to becoming a Cohen Gadol? See, I think that's a great question. I don't know. My guess, well, I'm sure we'll come to this at some point. My guess would be a Cohen Gadol didn't marry a widow. A Cohen married a widow. And then later, he became anointed and became Cohen Gadol. So I don't think there's a violation there. The question, would it be retroactive disqualification? And, we'll find out when we get to that law, when we get into the laws of the offerings and the priests themselves. Okay, this is a great day. Hope you guys enjoyed the flow of all these points as we worked our way through them. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.